beings in terms of having moral, non-natural properties. The view that being human is special is guilty of speciesism, an unjustified bias toward one's own species. On the atheistic view, human morality is just a byproduct of socio-biological evolution. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative behavior and even altruistic sacrificial behavior because evolution has determined that such behavior is advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, also exhibit similar behavior for the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species, in the struggle for survival. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything about Homo sapiens that makes this morality objectively true. What would Professor Tännsjö say, I wonder, to someone who denies that human beings are intrinsically valuable, or the flourishing of their species particularly important in the grand scheme of things? In an interesting article, Is Rape Wrong on Andromeda, Professor Michael Roos argues that rape may not be considered wrong by intelligent extraterrestrial life. He writes, although the immorality of rape is a human constant, we cannot thereby assume that it will be a constant for other organisms, including extraterrestrial intelligent organisms. Certainly, if we look elsewhere in the animal world, we see acts which look very much like rape occur on a regular basis. Furthermore, there are good biological reasons why this sort of behavior frequently occurs. If a male animal is prepared to attempt rape on occasion, he is more likely to reproduce than otherwise. But this raises two very troublesome questions for Professor Tännsjö's view. First of all, how should these extraterrestrials who consider rape moral behave toward us? Suppose they're sufficiently similar to mammals to be able to copulate with human females. In their view, raping throughout the earth would be morally just fine. If we protested, but your action doesn't contribute to the maximization of human happiness or pleasure, they would reply, who cares about human pleasure? What we care about is extraterrestrial pleasure. In fact, suppose they were as superior to us as we are to pigs and cattle, and they decided to farm the earth, to use us as food and laboring animals. On the atheistic view, there would seem to be nothing immoral about this, nor can I see why these extraterrestrials should be any more concerned about the happiness of our species than we are about the happiness of pigs and cows. Secondly, second question, why shouldn't the human rapist rape if he feels like it? Extraterrestrials do it. Animals do it. Why shouldn't we do it? All Professor Tännsjö can say is that it doesn't contribute to the greatest amount of human happiness. But so what? There's nothing particularly valuable about human beings or their happiness that should give us pause on the atheistic view. Professor Tännsjö is guilty, I think, of speciesism. And I just can't see any reason why, on the atheistic view, that we should regard human happiness as objectively good. Second, if God does not exist, then objective moral duties do not exist. On the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. Why think that apart from God, we would have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what would impose such obligations upon us? Richard Taylor, who is a non-Christian ethicist, makes this point effectively when he writes, a duty is something that is owed, but something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as duty in isolation. The idea of political or legal obligation is clear enough. Similarly, the idea of an obligation higher than this, and referred to as moral obligation, is clear enough, provided reference to some lawmaker higher than those of the state is understood. In other words, our moral obligations can be understood as those that are imposed by God. This does give a clear sense to the claim that our moral obligations are more binding upon us than our political obligations. But, he asks, what if this higher than human lawmaker is no longer taken into account? Does the concept of moral obligation still make sense? He answers, the concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. In particular, why think that on the atheistic view we have any obligation at all to promote the greatest amount of human happiness? Who lays such an obligation upon us? Why is the egoist wrong when he regards his own happiness as more important than the happiness of all those other people he doesn't even know? On the atheistic view, why should their happiness be more important to him than his own happiness? I honestly can't see any reason why, on the atheistic view, we have an obligation to do anything. Finally, third, if atheism is true, there is no moral accountability for one's actions. Even if there were objective values and duties under naturalism, they're irrelevant because there is no moral accountability. If life ends at the grave, then it makes no difference whether one lives as a Joseph Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. As the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky rightly said, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. The state torturers in the communist Soviet prisons understood this all too well. Richard Wurmbrand, who was tortured in communist prisons, reports, the cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when man has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man. The communist torturers often said, there is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish. I have heard one torturer even say, I thank God in whom I don't believe that I have lived to this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart. He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners. Given the finality of death, it really does not matter how you live. So what do you say to someone who concludes that we may as well just live as we please out of pure self-interest? This presents a pretty grim picture for an atheistic ethicist like Kai Nielsen of the University of Calgary. He writes, we have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that all really rational persons should not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality, end quote. Now, somebody might say, but it's in your best interests to live in a moral lifestyle. But clearly that's not always true. We all know situations in which self-interest runs smack in the face of morality. Moreover, if one is sufficiently powerful, like a Ferdinand Marcos or a Papadoc Duvalier, one can always ignore the dictates of conscience and safely live in self-indulgence. Historian Stuart C. Easton sums it up well when he writes, there is no objective reason why man should be moral, unless morality has different perspectives on morality, depending on whether or not God exists. If God exists, there is a sound foundation for morality. If God does not exist, then as Nietzsche saw, we are ultimately landed in nihilism. But the choice between these two need not be arbitrarily made. On the contrary, the very considerations that we